The next level of control are material presets, which are found at the blue MPRX Sphere tool. In a similar way to the Style Presets tool, the Material Presets tool will open a Presets UI, in which you can load and save your own materials. Loading will automatically set the material on a selected object. If you use the previous watercolor system, this tool is the equivalent of the Prep tool. Let me briefly explain the options on the right panel. By default, the Material Presets tool will not create a new material if not necessary. It will simply replace the existing attributes. Therefore, this option comes in handy when several objects share a material, but you only want a selected few to have a new material assigned to it with a preset. The next two options are enabled by default and load the preset textures and noise effects. Noise effects allow the procedural assignment of effects, a powerful tool which will be explained on a tutorial on its own. The Material Presets tool creates and modifies shader effect materials, which in turn grant the next level of control. You can access each material attribute of a selected object easily by using the purple Matte Sphere tool in the shelf. MNPR takes advantage of the shader effects materials within Maya, which give complete control to not only the exposed attributes, but even the shader code through its shader effects graph. This will certainly be a welcome addition for the visual development artist. However, this tutorial is not about shader effects, so we won't modify anything in the shader effects graph and instead will focus on the exposed material attributes. The most important attributes of a shader effects material are not called attributes, they are called settings. By default, the settings need to be opened first and show the shader options for the material. When manipulating these settings, you modify the shader code of the material and enable or disable material attributes. Because the shader code is modified and recompiled, changing settings might take a second or two, but they avoid unnecessary computation if certain settings are not needed in the material. The settings for the MNPR Uber shader effects material do the following. Reflectance model defines the diffuse reflectance algorithm of the material. Different algorithms change the way light is distributed along the object's surface. Vertex Controls enable and disable the vertex control influence over the effects. Keep in mind that this will only be visible if you have painted some vertices before. Shadow will enable or disable the casted shadows of the material. Flick back faces allows you to flip the normals pointing away from the view direction. This is useful for thin objects like leaves that don't have normals to both sides of its surface. Transparent enables the transparency in the material. When enabling or disabling this setting, new transparency attributes will appear or disappear. Specularity enables specular behavior in the material. Enabling this will show new settings that define the specular model and if the specularity should be drawn in the transparent parts of the object. Max Lights lets you define the maximum amount of supported lights in the material. Once all settings are set, the first group of attributes comprise the painterly shading attributes. These allow you to tweak the painterly behavior of the material. All these attributes go from 0 to 1, but when default values are in between, as is the case with Diffuse Factor, Cambiante, and Dilute Paint attributes, the shader effects material thinks that these are maximum values. We can't change this behavior, but you can type any desired values and the sliders will accommodate to them. Allow me to explain what each attribute does next. Diffuse Factor affects how diffuse the reflectance should be. 0 creates a flat shading, whereas 1 gives you the full diffuse behavior. Cambiante will shift the lit areas towards a brighter hue. Cambiante area will define the area where cambiante color behavior is performed. Dilute Paint will shift the lit areas towards the dilute color. When using textures, you will find yourself reducing this attribute a lot, as you are relying on albedo colors. Dilute area will define the area to dilute. Dilute color will define the dilution color. Shade override will enable the shaded surface to be overridden by the shade color. Shade color sets the color of the shaded surface when overridden or the color of the backlight for the shade wrap. Shade wrap creates a backlight on the shaded parts of the object. Highlight roll-off and its highlight transparency will override the shading to create a highlight. This highlight is different than a specular highlight, as it does not depend on the view direction and remains fixed to the light direction. The second group of attributes comprises the normal shading attributes. Color tint can act as a material color by itself, or as a color tint on applied textures. A white color tint will show the color of the texture unchanged. Albedo texture enables or disables the texture that is loaded as the albedo texture file. Normal map enables or disables the normal map loaded as the normal map file. Invert U and invert V allows you to flip the normal map direction in case it's needed. Bump depth adjusts the strength of the normal map to increase or decrease the bumpiness of the material. Specular Map enables or disables the specular map loaded as the specular map file. Specular roll-off defines the size of the specular highlight. Specular diffusion defines the hardness of the specular highlight. Finally, specular transparency defines the intensity of the specular highlight. Keep in mind that the specular attributes will only appear in the material if specularity has been enabled in settings. Likewise, the last group appears if the transparent setting has been enabled in the material. This group contains the alpha mask, which enables or disables the alpha mask loaded as the alpha mask file, and surface mask cutoff, which defines the alpha threshold at which pixels are not rendered anymore, showing whatever is behind instead. Sometimes you might see a group of attributes called stylization, procedural. These are attributes that are modified by the noise effects tool, so you can mostly ignore them unless you want to key them. It sometimes happens that when modifying the shader effects settings, the attribute editor stops updating. To fix this, double-click on the purple matte shelf icon to force the attribute editor to refresh. Finally, do remember that you can also specify a shadow color on the lights within the scene. It might come in handy. This concludes the tutorial on material presets and material control. Now get ready to dive into the lowest levels of control as we explore the potential of noise effects to facilitate procedural effects on the material and paint effects to locally control effects at the vertex level.